you ever feel completely drained after a day of being endlessly agreeable? Have you noticed that persistent ache in your chest when you constantly bend over backwards to avoid conflict? I'm about to share something that might disturb you deeply. This relentless drive to be the good person everyone expects might actually be slowly poisoning your soul in ways you never imagined. You spend every waking moment carefully crafting your responses, monitoring your facial expressions, editing your authentic reactions before they escape. You've convinced yourself that swallowing resentment, hiding disappointment, and suppressing frustration makes you a better human being. How often do you bite your tongue when injustice stares you in the face? How frequently do you nod and agree when your entire being wants to scream no? When was the last time you expressed genuine anger without immediately feeling guilty about it? This isn't isolated behavior. Millions of people are suffocating under the weight of compulsive agreeableness. We've built invisible prisons from social expectations that demand we remain perpetually pleasant, eternally understanding, forever accommodating. These ideals sound beautiful in theory, but Carl Jung, one of psychology's most revolutionary minds, discovered something chilling about our obsession with being good. Jung revealed that our conscious personality, this carefully constructed, nice version of ourselves, is only half the story. Beneath the surface lurks what he called the shadow. Every impulse we've deemed unacceptable, every desire we've labeled selfish, every emotion we've branded as inappropriate. The more desperately we try to eliminate these aspects through relentless pleasantness, the more fractured we become internally. This creates a devastating split between your authentic self and your performed self. The performed self smiles when hurt, agrees when angry, and gives when depleted. Meanwhile, your authentic self withers in darkness, accumulating years of unexpressed truth. This division doesn't make you virtuous, it makes you psychologically fragmented. Here's what nobody wants to acknowledge. Your excessive niceness often isn't genuine compassion. It's a sophisticated control mechanism designed to manage how others perceive and treat you. You've learned that being agreeable buys you safety from rejection, criticism, and abandonment. But this transaction comes at a devastating cost, the slow death of your authentic voice. Let me ask you something that might sting. What's the point of being universally liked if you can't even recognize yourself anymore? What value is there in others' approval if you're slowly disappearing behind a mask of perpetual pleasantness? Jung understood that real compassion doesn't emerge from forcing ourselves to be nice. It arises when we courageously embrace our complete humanity, including the parts we'd rather deny. When we stop performing perfection, something remarkable happens. We develop genuine empathy born from acknowledging our shared human struggles. If you recognize yourself in these words, if you feel exhausted from constantly performing goodness, stay with me. Because today we're going to explore how your pursuit of moral perfection might actually be the cage that's keeping you from experiencing real freedom and authentic connection. From your earliest memories, you've been indoctrinated with a simple equation: goodness equals worthiness. Be a pleasant child, an agreeable student, a helpful friend, a cooperative employee. This programming runs so deep that being nice feels less like a choice and more like a survival requirement. There's an invisible taskmaster in your head constantly evaluating, am I being good enough? Am I being too demanding? Will they still like me if I express this need? But here's what they never told you about this seemingly noble pursuit. The pressure to maintain constant agreeableness can become a form of psychological torture. You begin living like an actor who can never break character, someone who's forgotten where the performance ends and the real person begins. Think about how often you've swallowed your authentic response because it might make someone uncomfortable. How many times have you endured disrespect, absorbed blame that wasn't yours, or tolerated boundary violations just to maintain your reputation as someone who never causes problems? How frequently have you apologized for things that weren't your fault simply because it was easier than dealing with conflict? This conditioning teaches you that your value as a human being depends entirely on your agreeability. Every smile you receive, reinforces the performance, while any sign of disapproval feels like a threat to your very existence. You become addicted to approval, living on an emotional roller coaster where others' reactions determine your self-worth. Carl Jung saw through this facade with laser-like precision. He understood that every human psyche contains aspects we consider unacceptable: our capacity for anger, selfishness, envy, and even cruelty. These aren't moral failures, they're simply part of being human. The problem arises when we try to eliminate these natural impulses through compulsive pleasantness. Jung called this rejected material the shadow, and he warned that trying to destroy it is like attempting to eliminate your reflection by smashing mirrors. The shadow doesn't disappear when ignored. It goes underground, influencing your behavior in subtle but powerful ways. Your niceness often becomes a compensation for the parts of yourself you're desperately trying to hide. This creates an exhausting internal war. You're constantly battling against aspects of yourself that are as natural as breathing. You smile when you want to frown, agree when you want to argue, give when you want to receive. This isn't virtue, it's self-abandonment disguised as morality. The cruel irony is that this performance rarely achieves its intended goal. People can sense inauthenticity even when they can't name it. Your forced agreeableness might earn you the label of nice, but it rarely generates the deep connection and genuine respect you're actually seeking. You end up surrounded by people who appreciate your function, but don't really know who you are. Jung understood that this splitting of the psyche creates profound suffering. You live divided against yourself, constantly policing your thoughts and feelings, never allowing your full humanity to emerge. Every natural impulse becomes evidence of your moral failure. Every moment of authentic feeling gets buried under layers of performed goodness. The tragedy is that you think you're being virtuous when you're actually committing violence against your own soul. And this violence has consequences that extend far beyond your personal suffering. It affects every relationship you have and every decision you make. If you're starting to recognize the prison you've built around yourself, don't look away, because understanding this dynamic is the first step toward reclaiming your authentic power. Now we need to confront something that will challenge everything you believe about human nature. You are not naturally good all the time. Nobody is. And pretending otherwise is slowly destroying your psychological health. Carl Jung spent decades studying the human psyche, and he discovered something that most people find deeply uncomfortable. Beneath our civilized exterior exists what he termed the shadow, a repository of every impulse, desire, and capacity we've been taught to reject. This isn't some mystical concept. It's a psychological reality that influences every aspect of your behavior. Your shadow contains your repressed anger, your hidden selfishness, your capacity for manipulation, your secret envies and resentments. It houses every thought you've judged as bad and every feeling you've labeled as inappropriate. Jung realized that these aspects don't disappear when we deny them. They simply operate from the unconscious, shaping our choices in ways we don't recognize. Here's the disturbing truth: even your most seemingly altruistic acts are often influenced by shadow motivations. When you help someone, aren't you frequently hoping for gratitude, recognition, or at least the satisfaction of feeling morally superior? When you remain silent during conflicts, isn't there often a part of you that enjoys the moral high ground this gives you over others? When you sacrifice your needs for others, don't you sometimes expect them to notice and appreciate your selflessness? Jung would say, this is completely normal. The problem isn't that you have these motivations. The problem is that you refuse to acknowledge them. This denial forces your shadow to express itself through indirect means: passive aggression, martyrdom, subtle manipulation, or emotional withdrawal. Consider how often your niceness serves hidden agendas. You're agreeable because disagreement feels dangerous. You're helpful because being needed feels safer than being wanted for who you are. You avoid conflict because you'd rather be seen as peaceful than deal with the messy reality of standing up for yourself. The more you try to suppress these natural human impulses, the more distorted they become. Unexpressed anger turns into depression or chronic irritability. Unacknowledged selfishness emerges as martyrdom that demands appreciation. Hidden envy manifests as comparing yourself to others and finding them somehow lacking. This is why people who pride themselves on being good often struggle with mysterious health issues, relationship problems, or a persistent sense that something is missing from their lives. They're literally fighting a war against half of their own psyche, and that war is exhausting. Jung wasn't suggesting we become selfish monsters. He was pointing out that psychological health requires acknowledging our complete humanity. When you recognize and accept your shadow impulses, something remarkable happens. They lose their unconscious power over you. You can choose how to respond to them rather than being driven by them unconsciously. The person who admits they sometimes feel envious is less likely to sabotage others unconsciously. The individual who acknowledges their capacity for selfishness can make conscious choices about when to be generous and when to protect their own interests. The human being who accepts their anger can express it appropriately instead of letting it poison their relationships through passive aggression. This leads us to a crucial realization. Your compulsive niceness isn't protecting you from your shadow. It's ensuring that your shadow controls you from the unconscious. And this unconscious influence is far more dangerous than conscious acknowledgement of your complete humanity. In the next section, we'll explore how this dynamic plays out in one of the most destructive patterns Jung observed, the way people use self-sacrifice as both a weapon and a shield. Let's examine one of the most socially celebrated, yet psychologically destructive patterns Jung identified: compulsive self-sacrifice. You've probably been taught that putting others first is the hallmark of a good person, that your needs should always come second, that true virtue means giving until it hurts. But Jung discovered something unsettling about people who make self-sacrifice their identity. They're often engaged in one of the most sophisticated forms of psychological manipulation ever devised. And the most disturbing part, they're usually completely unconscious of what they're doing. When you constantly sacrifice your needs, desires, and boundaries for others, you're not just being generous, you're creating an elaborate system of emotional debts. Every time you give more than you want to give, stay longer than you want to stay, or agree to things that violate your authentic desires, you're making an unconscious withdrawal from others' emotional bank accounts. This creates what Jung might call a savior complex. You become indispensable by making others dependent on your sacrifice. You're the one who always says yes, who never complains, who handles everyone else's problems while neglecting your own. On the surface, this looks like virtue. Underneath, it's often a desperate attempt to control how others see and treat you. The psychological payoff is enormous. You get to feel morally superior while simultaneously ensuring that people need you. You avoid the vulnerability of being wanted for who you are by making yourself essential for what you do. You sidestep the risk of rejection by making yourself too useful to abandon. But there's a deadly price for this pattern. Jung observed that people who live in compulsive self-sacrifice develop what he called resentment poisoning. You give and give and give, but deep down, you're keeping score. You notice when your sacrifices aren't appreciated. You feel hurt when others don't reciprocate your level of dedication. You develop a secret sense of superiority over people you perceive as more selfish than you. This resentment rarely gets expressed directly. That would conflict with your image as someone who's above such petty emotions. Instead, it seeps out through martyred sighs, passive-aggressive comments, emotional withdrawal, or sudden explosions that seem to come out of nowhere. You know the type, the person who does everything for everyone, but periodically has emotional breakdowns where they cry, "Nobody appreciates me. I give and nobody cares." These outbursts aren't character flaws. They're pressure valves releasing years of accumulated resentment. Jung saw that this pattern makes you incredibly vulnerable to psychological manipulation. Because you've built your identity around being helpful and understanding, you become an easy target for anyone who knows how to exploit guilt. You can't say no without feeling selfish. You can't protect your boundaries without feeling mean. You can't prioritize your own needs without feeling like you're betraying your values. Gradually, you disappear. You stop existing as an individual with personal desires and start existing solely as a function in other people's lives. You become the person others call when they need something, but not necessarily the person they call when they want to celebrate or connect. Society encourages this pattern because self-sacrificing people are convenient. They don't make demands. They don't create conflict. They absorb problems rather than addressing them. But Jung understood that this lifestyle is psychologically unsustainable. Eventually, the repressed needs and resentments will demand expression, often in ways that destroy the very relationships the self-sacrifice was meant to preserve. The most tragic aspect is that compulsive self-sacrifice often prevents the very thing it's trying to achieve. Genuine intimacy. When you're always performing goodness, people never get to know your authentic self. They relate to your function, not your essence. The deep connection you crave remains elusive because you've hidden your real personality behind a wall of helpfulness. Jung's insight was revolutionary. Healthy relationships require authentic self-expression, including the expression of your needs, boundaries, and even your shadow impulses. The goal isn't to eliminate self-sacrifice, but to make it conscious and voluntary rather than compulsive and manipulative. This brings us to an even more uncomfortable truth about how we weaponize our virtue against others. Here's where Jung's analysis becomes truly disturbing. The very virtue you pride yourself on can become a sophisticated weapon of psychological manipulation. And the most dangerous part is that you probably don't even realize you're doing it. Think carefully about your motivations when you're being nice. How often is your kindness truly free of expectation? How frequently do your good deeds come with invisible strings attached? When you're patient with someone's difficult behavior, aren't you often secretly expecting them to notice and appreciate your tolerance? When you avoid confrontation to keep the peace, don't you sometimes enjoy the moral superiority this gives you over people who are more direct? Jung understood that our conscious minds excel at creating noble narratives for shadow motivations. You tell yourself you're being kind to help others, but unconsciously you might be gathering evidence of your moral superiority. You believe you're being understanding to maintain harmony, but secretly you're collecting ammunition to use the next time someone criticizes you. This is what makes moral manipulation so insidious. It's wrapped in the language of virtue. You're not controlling others, you're helping them. You're not avoiding conflict, you're keeping the peace. You're not collecting emotional debts, you're being generous. The beautiful words mask the shadow dynamics underneath. Consider how often good people use their virtue as a form of emotional blackmail. The parent who sacrifices everything for their children, but frequently reminds them of this sacrifice. The friend who's always available but makes subtle comments about how busy everyone else seems to be. The partner who never complains but whose martyred silence speaks volumes about their unacknowledged resentment. Jung saw that this dynamic creates toxic relationship patterns. Your goodness becomes a way to maintain power while appearing powerless. You can control others through guilt while maintaining your self-image as someone who would never try to control anyone. You can express anger through hurt disappointment while preserving your identity as someone who doesn't get angry. The most sophisticated practitioners of moral manipulation have learned to make others feel guilty for not appreciating their sacrifice enough, for not being as selfless as they are, for having needs and boundaries that conflict with the helper's agenda. They weaponize their virtue to maintain relationships on their terms, while the other person feels perpetually guilty for not matching their level of selflessness. This pattern is particularly devastating because it's so difficult to confront. How do you challenge someone who's only trying to help? How do you set boundaries with someone who's just being kind? How do you address manipulation that's disguised as generosity? the moral manipulator has created a nearly perfect defense system. Jung realized that society enables this dynamic by glorifying self-sacrifice without examining its psychological motivations. We praise people who give endlessly without asking why they need to give so much, what they're hoping to receive in return, or what they're trying to avoid by staying in the helper role. The tragedy is that this pattern prevents authentic intimacy. When your kindness is motivated by control needs, fear of rejection, or desire for moral superiority, it creates relationships based on guilt and obligation rather than genuine affection and respect. People may stay connected to you, but they're responding to your function, not choosing your person. Jung's revolutionary insight was that acknowledging these shadow motivations doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you an honest one. When you can admit that your virtue sometimes serves selfish purposes, you become capable of choosing when to be generous from genuine care versus when you're operating from unconscious manipulation. This leads us to Jung's most hopeful discovery: what authentic compassion actually looks like when it's freed from shadow contamination. We've reached the heart of Jung's most profound insight. True compassion cannot be manufactured through willpower or moral effort. It emerges naturally when you stop fighting your shadow and start integrating it into conscious awareness. Jung discovered that authentic compassion has a completely different quality than performed niceness. Genuine caring arises spontaneously when you recognize that your struggles, fears, and shadow impulses are universal human experiences. When you stop pretending to be above these natural aspects of humanity, you develop what Jung called active imagination, the ability to see your own psychological patterns reflected in others. This recognition dissolves the artificial boundary between self and other that compulsive niceness actually reinforces. When you're performing goodness, you're unconsciously maintaining a position of moral superiority. You're the helper, they're the helped. You're the strong one, they're the weak one. You're the giver, they're the taker. This dynamic prevents true intimacy, even as it appears to create connection. But when you acknowledge your own capacity for selfishness, manipulation, and emotional neediness, something remarkable happens. You stop seeing others as projects to fix or recipients of your charity and start seeing them as fellow travelers struggling with the same fundamental human challenges. The compassion that emerges from this recognition requires no effort because it's based on genuine understanding rather than performed virtue. Jung observed that people who have integrated their shadows become naturally generous without keeping score. They help others not to collect gratitude or maintain moral superiority, but because they recognize suffering and respond to it instinctively. Their kindness flows from fullness rather than emptiness, from strength rather than neediness, from choice rather than compulsion. This integrated compassion has several distinctive qualities. First, it includes healthy boundaries. You can care deeply for someone while refusing to enable their dysfunction. You can offer support without taking responsibility for others' choices. You can be loving without being self-sacrificing. Second, integrated compassion is honest. You don't pretend problems don't exist to maintain harmony. You don't avoid difficult conversations to preserve your image as someone who's easy to get along with. You speak truth with kindness, even when that truth is uncomfortable. Third, this authentic caring is sustainable. Because it doesn't depend on others' responses for validation, you can maintain it even when people don't appreciate your efforts. Because it emerges from self-acceptance rather than self-denial, it doesn't create resentment or emotional depletion. Jung understood that this kind of compassion only becomes possible when you stop trying to eliminate your shadow and start developing a conscious relationship with it. You begin to notice when you're being kind to avoid conflict versus when you're responding to genuine caring. You recognize when your helpfulness is motivated by fear versus when it's flowing from choice. The paradox Jung discovered is profound. The more you accept your capacity for selfishness, the more genuinely generous you become. The more you acknowledge your potential for manipulation, the more authentic your relationships become. The more you embrace your shadow, the more light you have to offer others. This doesn't mean becoming selfish or manipulative. It means developing conscious choice about when and how to express these impulses. The person who knows they can be selfish is free to choose generosity. The individual who acknowledges their capacity for manipulation can choose authentic communication. The human being who accepts their complete nature can respond to situations from wisdom rather than unconscious compulsion. Jung's final insight brings us full circle to the liberating truth that will transform how you relate to yourself and others. Carl Jung's ultimate revelation challenges everything our culture teaches about virtue. The path to authentic goodness requires embracing your capacity for what society calls evil. This isn't moral relativism or permission to behave badly. It's the recognition that psychological wholeness depends on integrating rather than rejecting your shadow. Every moment you spend forcing yourself to be perfect is a moment of violence against your essential nature. When you suppress anger, you don't eliminate it. You drive it underground where it becomes depression, passive aggression, or chronic resentment. When you deny your selfishness, it doesn't disappear. It expresses itself through subtle manipulation and martyrdom. When you refuse to acknowledge your capacity for cruelty, it manifests as judgment of others and emotional coldness disguised as moral superiority. Jung understood that the shadow cannot be destroyed, only transformed through conscious recognition. Your anger can become fierce compassion for injustice. Your selfishness can evolve into healthy self-care and boundary setting. Your capacity for manipulation can transform into skillful communication and persuasion used for beneficial purposes. The obsession with being good creates an internal civil war that consumes enormous amounts of psychological energy. You live split between your authentic experience and your performed personality, constantly editing your responses to fit social expectations. This division doesn't create virtue, it creates exhaustion, resentment, and spiritual emptiness. But here's Jung's most liberating insight. When you stop fighting your shadow, you discover something remarkable. The energy you were using to repress natural impulses becomes available for genuine creativity, authentic relationships, and purposeful action. The psychological resources you were spending on maintaining a false persona can be redirected toward becoming who you actually are. This integration process transforms your relationship with others in profound ways. When you accept your own capacity for jealousy, you stop judging others for their envy and can respond to it with understanding. When you acknowledge your potential for cruelty, you can recognize it in others without becoming triggered or defensive. When you embrace your selfishness, you can appreciate others' self-care without taking it personally. The person who has befriended their shadow becomes genuinely tolerant because they understand that everyone contains the full spectrum of human potential. They don't need to maintain moral superiority because they're not afraid of their own darkness. They can be kind without being weak, strong without being cruel, generous without being depleted. Jung discovered that this acceptance of your complete nature paradoxically makes you more ethical, not less. When you're not fighting unconscious impulses, you can make conscious choices about how to behave. When you're not maintaining a false persona, your actions can flow from authentic values rather than social expectations. The energy you free up by ending the war against yourself becomes available for what Jung called individuation, becoming the unique person you were meant to be rather than the generic good person society demands. This isn't selfishness. It's the recognition that the world needs your authentic contribution, not your performed compliance. Imagine the relief of saying, I have the capacity for selfishness, anger, and manipulation, and that's part of being human. Imagine the freedom of making choices from self-awareness rather than compulsion. Imagine relationships based on genuine acceptance rather than moral performance. Jung's promise is simple but revolutionary. When you stop trying to be perfect, you become capable of real goodness. When you embrace your shadows, you develop authentic compassion. When you accept your complete humanity, you become truly helpful to others because you're helping from choice rather than compulsion. The goal isn't to eliminate your shadow. It's to dance with it consciously. And in that dance, you discover not just freedom from the exhausting performance of goodness, but the joy of being genuinely helpful, authentically kind, and truly alive. If these ideas resonate with your experience, share your thoughts in the comments. And if this exploration has brought you some measure of relief or insight, consider subscribing to continue this journey toward authentic living. The next video will take us even deeper into Jung's wisdom about becoming who you really are.